Welcome to Help Me I'm Poor, the money podcast that's more XOXO than Excel spreadsheets. I'm Ellie.
And I'm Claire, and each week we discuss how money shows up in our favourite pop culture, from the classic to the nostalgic to the contemporary. If you enjoy this podcast, please do tell your friends about it. Please follow us wherever you get your podcasts. Leave a 5-star rating and maybe a review. You can also follow us on socials at Help Me I'm Poorcast. Find us on YouTube and send us an email at helpmeimpoorpodcast@gmail.com to tell us what you'd like us to talk about in future episodes.
So today we are heading across the pond and we are going to the Upper East Side. And I'm very excited to talk about Gossip Girl because this is probably the number one most iconic show, I would say, from my teen years. And it definitely had a huge influence on my outlook on the world. And I guess what I thought my life might look like. Spoiler alert, it doesn't. But just to give a little bit of a summary to anybody that may be listening and hasn't seen it, Gossip Girl actually was a book series initially, and the first book was released in 2002. So I read the books, first of all, and then in 2007, it was made into a TV show. And the premise is that it's all about an anonymous blogger who follows documents the lives of these extremely wealthy high school children, kids in New York City on the Upper East Side. And anybody that knows much about Manhattan will know that the Upper East Side is where the super wealthy people live. And there are 4 main characters. You've got Serena, Blair, Nate and Chuck, who are these really beautiful, really rich, having a great time kids. They're about 15, I think, when we first meet them.
Wow, so young.
Yeah, so young. And then we also meet the other 2 main characters, who are Dan and Jenny, who are also at the same schools. There's a boys' school and a girls' school, and they're both on the Upper East Side. But Dan and Jenny live in Brooklyn and don't live on the Upper East Side. They just happen to go to school there. And this kind of gives you a little bit of context as to where this goes. But the series and the books really explore the dynamics of what goes on with this group. And it dives into really like what life looks like for these ultra wealthy teenagers as they kind of go through their adolescent years and get into adulthood. And the thing that I find so interesting about looking through the lens of money in the context of this podcast with Gossip Girl is how obscene the wealth actually is. And that is obviously the premise of it, but I don't think I realised when I watched it quite how elite, I guess, the lifestyles that were being portrayed were.
Yeah, and how sort of out of reach, I think, because if we're looking at it in terms of what anybody could hope to achieve, obviously all of the parents have got jobs.
Yeah.
But I think you're led to believe that that's what gives them their wealth. And in actual fact, I think all of them, apart from like Dan and Jenny's family, come from family wealth, like really old money.
Yeah.
And it's just this thing where I think, obviously, the more generational wealth, the more of a springboard that you have to go into these like really illustrious careers. Like maybe your dad invests in your business, maybe your mum invests in your business. And so there seems to be so much emphasis throughout the storyline on like passing wealth on to the next generation and like sort of grooming your children to take on the mantle, like from the really like very first episode. Like, just for an example, Chuck is not allowed to choose what university he's going to go to. And like that's set out from the start of just like, well, no, I mean, you're obviously going to go where I went.
Yeah. And it's kind of part of the deal, really. It's like, if you get this privilege, which I'm giving you, you have to follow in my footsteps and basically like live the life that I want you to live rather than making your own decisions. But it's so true, actually, because one of the things that I think is quite clear throughout the story, because there is this big plot line where Blair's mum, Eleanor Waldorf, is this big fashion designer. And so you do get this impression that, you know, like she's working really hard, she's got this business. But also, if you kind of dig into it, the whole premise of the Waldorf family is that their money comes from the Waldorf Astoria Hotel, which is like one of the most famous hotels in Manhattan. And so it's this contrast between this presentation of, oh, the successful working mum. But actually, like you say, she's got this massive inheritance and legacy behind, which is probably propping up this business.
Isn't that like so true to life though? Because don't we have this narrative in the real world of these self-made people, but then you find out that their parent or member of their family had like done really well for themselves and gave them their first 100 grand to invest in their business, like cough, brewdog cough. I just feel like it's so like pervasive in our culture in real life that sort of you can be from really old money or even just like sort of moderate generational wealth. And it's so true that like you could then just rest on your laurels and be like have your lifestyle funded by your family wealth, and it's a choice then to like go and try and make something of yourself. But I don't think we can pretend that it's the same as like building something from nothing.
Yeah. And it's so interesting because I feel like we often hear those stories. Those are the ones that I guess maybe people that shout the loudest for that reason of entrepreneurs where they've built from the ground up and they had nothing and then they've become something. But we don't really hear about all of those ones that you mentioned. They've just had a bit of money given to them. And actually, I remember my husband saying this. So he knew people at university, and there's one person in particular that he mentioned who basically, since they left university, which is what, like 10 years ago now, has just had a series of businesses that have failed and just keep starting them, and then they fail and they start another one. And the reason they can do that is because their mum is a very, very well-known cosmetics mogul who made a lot of money and sold a business, and basically they are just propping up this ability to try being entrepreneurial. But this person has literally never had a job. They've just tried and failed with these businesses and will probably continue to do so. And you don't really hear about that. You sometimes hear, I guess, when there's the success, but you don't see all of these people that are trying and failing and testing and going again, because like I guess you wouldn't probably talk about that until you've got to the success point.
Exactly. I was going to say like, but as soon as they've got the successful one, they'll quite often be like, it took me 12 failed businesses to get here. And my first thought is always like, okay, so who was bankrolling that? But I think one of the things that I do think is like quite refreshing, and it is quite sort of naughty's girl boss culture, is that like there's quite an even split. It's not that the dads all have the money and work really hard. There are some like, you know, quite sort of empowered female characters, even if their wealth is quite often like inherited or
through marriage.
With Serena's mum, she's got like the triple whammy, hasn't she? She's got the old money, she's got the divorce money, and she's got the career money. So but I do think that it's quite evenly represented.
I would say that I think that the strong characters, like you say, are actually quite evenly split, because the women in it are presented as being like real kind of forces in a positive way, and like you wouldn't mess with like Lily and you wouldn't mess with Eleanor, and in the same way that the men are presented.
I mean, I think that's one thing that is sort of in its favor for how things are represented. But then the like levels of wealth that are on display are so disproportionate to anything. And I think the fact that then relative to like the Vanderwoodsons and co, that Dan and Jenny are considered poor, even though they live in this like insane Brooklyn loft that I think is estimated to be worth like 2 million.
This, I think, is one of the most fascinating parts of the show when you look into it and how the different characters are presented. And I will kind of caveat with the fact that the books do actually, I guess, differentiate more than the TV show. I think when the TV show came out, I remember being shocked by how they'd cast Taylor Momsen as Jenny, because she is very petite, very blonde, very pretty. In the books, that is not the Jenny that we are described. Like she's kind of described as being like very normal, like she's brunette, she's quite bookwormish, and they completely switched her up for the TV show. So there is, I think, a bit more of a contrast in the books, but even in the show, it is very clear that they are presented as the inverted comma poor kids.
Mm.
And when you start to look at what their lifestyle is, then you start thinking, oh my gosh, how on earth could they be the poor kids? Because, like you say, they live in a loft, which is huge. And admittedly, when this came out 20 years ago or so, Brooklyn wasn't the Brooklyn it is today.
Mm.
But I did read that where it's located in Dumbo, that is like super rich Brooklyn now. So you would never kind of consider people that live there to be not very wealthy. It's a rich person place. And also just how they kind of talk about themselves. Like, there are a few things that Dan says, and we can come on to one of them, where you're like, is this just like a complete lack of awareness? Or is the reality that, if we step back and we put ourselves into this imaginary world, if you are upper middle class, you have got a level of material comfort, but you are surrounded by people who are trust fund kids,
Mm.
like, do you actually feel quite poor? Because do you lose perspective if you're in that situation of like the bigger world? Because your day-to-day life, you're going to school and you're surrounded by these kids who literally have what I read as described as FU money. Like, money is just not an issue for them
Mm.
whatsoever. If you actually maybe, don't have private jets, you don't have like unlimited credit cards, you don't have like the ability to just do whatever you want, whenever you want, kind of levels of money.
Mm.
Is there like a point where you do feel maybe actually like I do feel a bit like poor?
I think and I think it is so relative. I mean, like, there's there's always there's always going to be someone who's got more than you in most situations. But if you are constantly sort of looking up in terms of wealth, then you are always going to feel like you have less or like you don't have enough. And I think also within those circles, the wealth is quite like ostentatious and it is sort of like flaunted. And I think potentially like some of that will come from the like looking down on or narrowing of eyes of like, oh, what do you mean you can't afford XYZ? Or what do you mean
Yeah.
you live in Brooklyn or whatever? So I think quite often it's sort of that like insecurity is reflected in your environment. And I think
Yeah.
that, I've read quite a few sort of articles or like Substacks from people who got like scholarships to go to private school or people who went to Oxbridge, but from working class families. And I think that all of a sudden you're put into a different environment, and where you felt maybe quite lucky at a certain point, you then start to feel like almost like that gratitude disappears and you're just looking at what you don't have rather than what you do.
I always wonder this a lot about schools, and particularly like the elite schools. And
Mm.
I know, it's a whole nother conversation about private school these days, but I feel like what has happened since we were at school, and admittedly, I went to a private school for 5 years and I went to a grammar school for sixth form, but the difference between private school then versus now is huge in terms of how much it costs.
Mm.
The fees have absolutely lost the plot. And so when we were at school, like 20 years ago, it wasn't obviously cheap, but it was affordable for middle classes. Whereas now it's just out of reach for most middle class families to send your kids to private school. And really, you're kind of only going to be going now if you are like super wealthy, or if you're somehow getting a scholarship to take the edge off the majority of the fees. And I know that still there are a lot of schools that do offer those scholarships, but I do sometimes wonder, what does that do to your view of, I guess, the world and yourself?
Mm.
And I've spoken to people who have been to kind of notorious private schools, boarding schools, and some of the stories that you hear, it is just another world. Like, one school in particular in Somerset, actually, like I remember hearing about people flying in their horses, like on private jets to come to school. And
Right.
yeah, like And I'm just like, what is going on? And even if you're just normally wealthy enough that you can, afford to go to this school,
Or
and
have a horse.
yeah, but you're then at school with somebody who is being helicoptered around and flies their horse from Russia. Like,
I think that's so interesting. So I live in Bath, and it's very, as you can imagine, like very well provided with private schools, even like very local to Bath. So
yeah,
within 3 miles, there are numerous private schools. But then in sort of Somerset, you've got like Bruton,
yeah,
you've got Stonor, you've got loads of really sort of well established
yeah.
private schools and boarding schools. But there's one quite local to us, and they were running a summer holiday scheme. And my children go to state school. They're all still in primary anyway, but they'll go to a state secondary school because, like, frankly, we would never be able to afford to send them. And also, if we could, I don't think that's what I'd spend the money on. My two children, my two sons, went to the holiday scheme for a couple of days, and they were so like fish out of water just for that
Really?
time. Yeah, I think everyone, it was mostly children from the school that had gone to the holiday scheme, and they all sort of knew each other. But it really surprised me because in general, especially my older son, you could drop him into any new environment and he would make friends quite quickly. But for those couple of days, he didn't. But also just dropping off and picking up, like the facilities were
Insane.
so out of this world. Like huge like wooden climbing frames. They had like what you would definitely like want your child's school to be like,
Yeah.
ideally, if it weren't for like the big price tag that is attached to it. But yeah, so I can really see how if you were sort of not necessarily from that world, going to a private school on a scholarship might really like take you aback, and it might sort of result maybe in like a bit of a chip on your shoulder. And I think also the more time that you spend with people, the more their normality becomes like what you feel like you should have.
Yes.
And I wonder sometimes if that's what's wrong with us all when we're on social media, because if we're living in the world of the internet and our normality has suddenly become all of these people that we follow with lifestyles that are, I think it's less dangerous actually if it's the sort of like Serena van der Woodsen style
Yeah.
lifestyle. It's more when it's sort of
Like the Lydia Millen stuff, where it's so far away from what you can ever really imagine living like, that you just watch it because it kind of is like the comfort of like looking from the outside in.
Yeah, 100%. Like, just, yeah, the idea of going to stay at Claridge's because your heating's broken wouldn't like occur to most people. But it is like that in a way that is a bit like Gossip Girl, in that it's like fun to watch because it feels really out of reach. But I think the thing that's more sort of dangerous to us and like our spending habits and our expectations, and also, but like crucially for our sense of like contentment and satisfaction, is always the people who've got like just a little bit more than us.
It's that just a bit, like almost within reach, but just out of reach.
Yeah, exactly. And also like I think like the fact that it's so opaque as well as to how people afford their lifestyles, whereas in Gossip Girl it is sort of very much out in the open. It's like very like rich and proud type thing.
And I think there's something quite refreshing about that, in the sense like, you know, these people that have this money really exist. And I got into a Reddit thread about Gossip Girl where someone was saying like, is this actually like an accurate depiction like of what it's like at schools on the Upper East Side? And people were like, yeah, no, it is. Like, you may not have ever met anyone like this, but these people really exist. And like, this is what their lives are like. And some people were saying that actually there were parts of Gossip Girl that were like quite tame compared to what the reality was like, in terms of like the partying and like the drugs and things like. And so I think it's just sometimes worth thinking like, okay, yeah, maybe just because it's not in my sphere, it does exist. And actually, like, that's fine. Like, we can't expect everybody to live in the way that we live. I think sometimes that acknowledgement is quite hard, and it's quite uncomfortable. And like you say, I think it's harder when it's closer to our reality. But there are lots of people that have so much money. And it's kind of why on the whole private school, should they exist, should they not exist debate, I kind of feel like let them exist because, you know, the reality is there are some people who have so much money that their kids are never going to go to a state school. Like if we got rid of private schools, they'd probably just go to an international school.
Yeah, that's interesting.
And I understand a lot of the arguments about it. But I feel like a lot of the arguments against it are looking at that kind of like middle class level. Whereas if you're in that level where, you know, 50, 70 grand a year is nothing, like let them spend it on what they want.
And do you know what's so interesting is that genuinely, like so my sort of family's background is very much working class, but my parents were professionals, so a teacher and a social worker. And then as I grew up, they were sort of like comfortable because of their generation, basically, because, you know, and like everyone's favorite economist, Gary Stevenson, talks a lot about this. But there was a generation where you could work hard in a normal job and prosper.
Yeah.
And, you know, we all know what generations that was. But so they sort of became like more middle class, I suppose, just through happenstance almost. And so like, that's kind of the world that I grew up in. But because of where that had like come from, I think I genuinely, until embarrassingly recently, didn't realize how much money some people have. And it never would have occurred to me. Like, I just couldn't really conjure up the concept of a family that you might walk past on the street where 50 grand a year wouldn't be much to them. Like that just doesn't, because to my mind, like a 6-figure salary was outrageously wealthy.
Yeah.
And you know, as my earnings have increased, I have just realized that because the economy is collapsing around us, that you know, it doesn't go as far anymore, but also just that there are people for whom that is like a trifling amount. Like what would be my like dream salary in a year is absolutely nothing to them. And I genuinely didn't, I don't think, like grasp the fact that these families actually exist.
But I don't think you necessarily do unless you are through circumstances exposed to them, or you watch TV shows like Gossip Girl, which I literally grew up watching. So Gossip Girl and 90210 were like my bread and butter, and they are both super rich kid shows. And so for me, I think that's where I got a lot of this idea of like, oh, okay, there are people that live like a totally different universe, but obviously they're fictional. And then, you realize that, oh no, these people do exist. Okay, I've got a quick question for you. When you picture somebody that invests, who do you picture?
Be honest, was it a man in a suit? A Jordan Belfort type? Navy gilet on his days off, maybe?
Exactly. And that's the issue that I want to talk about. Because for too long, the world of investing has felt like it's been built for people like them, not for women like us.
Which is why we're so excited that Help Me I'm Poor is partnering with eToro on their Loud Investing initiative. It's all about raising our voices and making sure that other women see that investing is for us too.
Loud Investing was born from a simple idea. If women don't see themselves in the investing space, then they're way less likely to feel like it's something that they should or can do.
Think about it. In finance films or shows, women are usually the wives, the secretaries, the girlfriends. The men are the ones making the big money moves.
And outside finance, we're often painted as the spenders, the ones who are racking up the credit card bills. Confessions of a shopaholic, anyone?
Exactly. But it's time to flip the script because women do invest and we're good at it.
So let's talk about it. Let's be loud about it. Let's show other women from all walks of life that you don't need a finance degree or a pinstripe suit to take control of your money.
Get behind the movement. Let's make investing more visible, more inclusive, and way less Navy gilet.
Thank you so much to eToro for being our partner on Help Me I'm Poor. To find out more, head to the link in the show notes and join us in raising our voices and investing loudly.
And just a quick heads up, all content on Help Me Earn Poor is for information and educational purposes only. It should not be taken as investment or financial advice, personal recommendations, or an offer of any kind. Always do your own research.
eToro is a multi-asset investment platform. The value of your investments may go up or down. With investing, your capital is at risk. On the six-figure point, it brings me actually to one episode where they're talking. So Dan is talking to Rufus, his dad, about Yale, and he's applied to Yale and he's applied to financial aid, and he gets rejected from getting any financial aid. And his comment is something like, "Are we not needy enough?" And it's funny, and it's obviously like meant to be quite funny, but it kind of highlights the fact that, again, his perception of himself is clearly that he doesn't have that much money, that he could be classed as somebody that needs financial aid to go to university. And I don't know how much the Ivy League cost, but I'm guessing they're quite expensive. But still, I would imagine they probably have enough money based on like what we know about the Humphreys, that they could fund these fees, especially if he's been going to St. Jude's, which is like this super expensive school. So there's that kind of idea that he thinks that he should receive financial aid. But that made me think about an article I read really recently, which said that I think it's something like 9 in 10 Britons earning over £100,000 does not consider themselves to be wealthy. I think what it makes me think is back to your point about how you perceived £100,000 when you were younger and how you perceive it now. Because I'm quite surprised in some regards that the figure is 9 out of 10 don't perceive themselves to be wealthy.
Yeah, that's
but
surprising.
Actually, I have to admit, living in London, I'm kind of not surprised, because you will be shocked when you see how little £100,000 gets you. And I mean, I know there's so much to unpack around that figure, but I did also see a statistic recently. I think it was in Claire Barrett's article in the Financial Times.
I was about to mention this.
That effectively had the cut-offs for things that you get, like you lose a personal allowance, you don't get the childcare funded hours at 100,000. If that had moved in line with inflation since the introduction of it, it would now be 150,000. And so the fiscal drag that has happened is huge. And the people that are earning that 100,000 are now paying an effective tax rate of about 60%. So yes, it sounds like a lot of money, but actually when you do the maths, you can be left with very little, if anything, at the end of the month when you add in childcare and mortgages at the moment, which is kind of mad.
Yeah, and I think it's the fact as well that 100k mark is like a cliff edge, especially with the free childcare hours. So it is a cliff edge at which if you earn like just over, then you would have to earn 125-ish to like balance it out, which is mad. And I just want to caveat this by saying that like we do understand that a 6-figure salary is still a lot of money, and compared to kind of the median salary in the UK, which is around like 37, 38, but also the mode salary, which is somewhere in the 20,000s, is obviously a lot of money. But if you think also about kind of the circles that you might be moving in, if you're earning those higher salaries as well, if you're at like exec level, etc., it's very, very easy not to compare to the average with gratitude, but to compare with your immediate circle with resentment. And I think that is just what can quite often happen.
But also the costs, because whenever I talk about this on Instagram, then I get a lot of people who are in that bracket that message me. And the reality is, for a lot of people earning in that bracket, you will be living in the southeast because that's where a lot of the jobs are that pay that kind of money. And the costs are outrageous. Like you say, the childcare in the southeast, especially if you've got two children that are both in full-time childcare, you're looking at £3,000-4,000 a month. And when we take into account that actually if you're earning 100,000, I think your take-home pay is less than 6,000. Like, your childcare and your mortgage, how are you meant to actually live? And I understand that people will say move, but you can't move that far to get much more for your money outside of London. Like, you go to the home counties, you're still paying the same amount. Mortgage rates, as we know, have gone up a lot. House prices have gone up a lot. And childcare, if you've got no hours funded at all and you need nursery hours to be able to work, you're kind of stuck in that there's not that much room for maneuver.
Yeah, you can be really painted into a corner, I think, especially if you've kind of modeled what you can afford around either like a life pre-children or sort of like pre cost of living crisis and like just surging cost of everything.
Well, even if you did it and you modeled it based on an interest rate 4 years ago, and then you get your renewal and you need to remortgage, and then you've got another 5, 6, 7, £800 a month that you've got to find. And I think a lot of people are in that situation where they didn't realize quite how low interest rates were when they maxed themselves out. And then a few years later, everything has stagnated. Like, wages are not going up like as quickly as the cost of everything else. And you then find yourself where you've got to remortgage.
And even if your wages are going up, like in line with inflation, we've got this fiscal drag situation where people are being dragged into higher and higher tax brackets. It's a really interesting thing to talk about. But the other thing that I wanted to ask about was with the kids, like, because obviously they are all bankrolled into their future by their parents. And something that I was like thinking about or asking myself when I was watching is like, do you think that does result in like having a different kind of chip on your shoulder or feeling like anxious, or that there's lots of pressure, or that there's like a lack of motivation? I'm really interested in like that side of things as well.
Yeah. And effectively what happens is there's this pattern, and I think you see it with Chuck Bass as well, but there's this pattern of being given so much, but with the conditions that are attached to it. And I think you're right. I think that for some, it can result in there being not very much motivation. But I think that actually often what we see in these TV shows, and I imagine it probably does happen in real life, is huge amounts of pressure to succeed and to succeed in a very specific way, to succeed in the way that has been laid out for you rather than in a way that you choose. And I know, again, there's this caveat of like, well, a lot of people would say they'll take that pressure if you get all of this luxury life. But I don't know, I'm not sure that it's all it is cut out to be, because I cannot imagine what it must be like to feel like if you do not succeed in fulfilling the ambitions that someone else has for you, and this person that holds basically the purse strings on your entire life, that you basically everything gets pulled out from underneath you. You have to perform and you have to be this specific person. You have to carry on the mantle. Like, you have to keep the business running and succeeding, or you have failed. I think what often happens is basically your whole worth is tied to like that specific success, and that is all that they've known. And I don't know if I'd want that.
Yeah, and that is really interesting as well, of like, what happens if your family business fails?
Yeah, because I think you probably grow up not really even thinking that's a possibility if that's all you've known. But the other thing this makes me think of is a conversation that I had with an old housemate, and I will never forget this. And it's a slightly different point, but her mum was very successful. She is like a very senior person in a multinational organization, real career woman. And she had basically raised the kids on her own because the dad wasn't really in the picture.
Mm.
And because she was so successful, they had everything materially. They went to a very good boarding school. They lived in America for a bit and they had nannies. Like they were, materially, they wanted for nothing.
Mm.
But one day we were talking about this and my friend said to me, like, I would have given it all up for her to be around more.
Mm.
And I think it's so easy sometimes to, again, just look at the grass is greener and to think, oh, I would have no complaints if I had this empire or if I had this, rite of passage lined up for me. But there are things that come with that. There are conditions, there are caveats, there are trade-offs. There always are trade-offs. And I think sometimes it kind of can do us good to actually just acknowledge those and think, yeah, there are things that come really easy when you've got a lot of money, but there are also real downsides and issues that I suspect a lot of people in those situations have that we don't have to deal with.
Yeah, and so many of them are to do with parental absence, right? Because if you're obsessed with building your business, building your empire, growing wealth, then it's so, I mean, like literally, I feel it on a really micro level of like, if I've got something really important on with work, like getting ready to come and record this, I have to like block my children out. And it's not because I don't care. It's because if I go to them every time they want something, I'm not going to be ready and I'm going to miss my train. So, but I think that like a sort of parental absence, also depending on when you start boarding school, being sent away at a really young age as well. I will never forget, I think it was on Where There's a Will, There's a Way, is Jamie Lang's episode. And he tells the story of when he was dropped off at boarding school for the first time. And honestly, it just like broke my heart to think of like a 6 or 7 year old child just being dropped off and left.
So young.
But another thing is a really recent article in the iPaper that talks about people who are adults who are bankrolled by their parents still. And these are people who are like, some of them are in their 20s, which, like, let's face it, is not that unusual now. But then there's people in their 30s and 40s. And, one of them is talking about the fact that their dad is incredibly successful. Their mum died really young. And instead of being present and dealing with it, he's just always throwing money at her and her sister, like buying them really lavish things. And I have to say, like, the article overall did make me feel a bit sick. And I don't mind admitting that I do feel quite jealous sometimes. Just at the level of financial security, I think I don't really care about the material stuff, but just the thing of like being able to like not have to sort of almost kill yourself to buy a house, etc. But
when it's with the family, do you not think that there's also some kind of like weird dynamic that comes into play with, like, when you're an adult and then you're relying on your parents, there's this like weird dynamic going on?
Yeah, so the article goes into that quite a lot of like, it's a few different stories. We'll link it in the show notes because it is a fascinating read. And you'll have to like let us know how you felt about it, because it made me feel all kinds of like really uncomfortable feelings. But basically, there were so many things. There was the one that I was really fascinated by was like a 29-year-old guy who was talking a lot about how he didn't feel wealthy throughout, because it was almost like that you weren't allowed to like spend the money. The money that you have is always for the next generation. And he's talking about how he didn't feel wealthy, but then he did mention having a crush on the groundskeeper's daughter. Yeah, like bit iffy on that. But a big thing he's talking about is how like he can't like find someone to have a relationship with, and he's terrified that the amount of pressure that's been put on him to not like marry someone and get divorced and lose any of the money in the estate. And I just think that's so fascinating. So he was talking about like wanting to meet someone with their own wealth, and that some of his parents, like wealthy friends, had set up their children
Gosh.
with people from other families, like something from like Regency times.
Yeah, to try and protect the wealth.
And I think there's something in there that says like, you know, I think this is another one of the stories that's in there, but which is a woman who has married into a wealthy family, and she's saying like, when you marry someone who's wealthy, you are marrying into the family, you're marrying the family. And I found that so fascinating, because I love my in-laws, but I like to have the choice of when we see them and when we say yes to them and when we say no to them. And if you're sort of being kept on a financial leash, I think that's really, really difficult. And actually, anecdotally, I do know a few people who have married into wealthy families, and there are certain things that they don't want to do that they have to do.
Yeah, I think like that's kind of the deal. And I think it's the same with weddings to a degree on a much smaller scale. But it's like, if one of the families is paying for the whole wedding and they want to invite, the gardener and the neighbour and his dog.
And the groundskeeper and his
daughter. You kind of don't have much room for saying no, do you? And I've heard so many stories of where that's happened. And like, again, with friends and stuff, like you get parents who are like, well, I'm paying 50 grand, so I want my hairdresser to come to your wedding. And you're like, well, I've never met this person, but okay, I suppose. And it's just like that on a macro level for your entire life.
Yeah, it is so fascinating how some people, both like in fiction and then also in real life, do sort of use money as a way to control their children. And then there are some people, obviously, like just to sort of show both sides of it, who are like really generous with money, and it doesn't come with any strings attached, and are genuinely trying to set their children up not to have the like financial stress and worry, rather than to sort of be able to have all of the like nice material things or pass on the wealth to the next generation.
Do you know what though? I would love to know if anyone has genuinely had that happen, because I struggle to believe that there are situations where there are vast amounts involved and there's no caveats at all, or no expectations, or no terms. I can't think of an example where
you're right.
That's happened.
I think it's always sort of smaller amounts where it's like here's a gift,
10 grand, here's 20 grand.
Yeah.
But like when you're talking like levels to buy like a property or whatever, there's always seemingly some sort of like expectation, at least, if not like condition attached.
And even if there isn't the expectation and condition with your parents, they're then another one of those stories in that article, which like I really think everyone should read. It's so fascinating. But another one of the stories in that article is a woman who is, I think she's 24, but she's got like a £750,000 apartment, and her parents gave her £650 to go towards it, so she must have a mortgage of like 100 grand. Yeah, exactly. But then the embarrassment in that story of like, I haven't told anyone apart from my boyfriend. I'm assuming my friends must know something, and it like you can really feel the like tangible embarrassment. And I think there's part of me that's like, oh, boo-hoo, poor little rich girl, but also sort of I think it does make things like it can make things really awkward with you and your family, but it can make things really awkward with you and your friends as well.
And I remember reading that one actually, because I read it on the way here, and she was a junior doctor. And I can imagine that like there is a bit of a weirdness around it, because obviously like it's a job where notoriously you are underpaid, and she's probably in a position, and this is obviously a lot of assumptions, but where she maybe doesn't need to work, or she doesn't need to go and like grind as hard as you will as a doctor to be comfortable, but she's chosen to do that, and obviously has like good reasons for wanting to do that. And I can imagine that like it maybe does feel a bit awkward if you're in a group of people where they really are kind of needing to do that job to earn the money and to try and get to a level of seniority, like consultant, where you are earning like a decent amount of money. for you to just kind of be there, and for your friends maybe to think like, well, you don't even need to be here. Like, why are you? I don't know. I just think it's really interesting. But before we kind of wrap up, because I could talk about this for days, I think one thing I would love to know is, what would you do with your kids if you were in a position to give them that kind of lifestyle? If you were a multimillionaire, how on earth do you think you would manage it with
Oh God.
kids? Because I think about this a lot. Not that I am in the situation. I think it's quite a hard thing to think about. I think it's quite a hard decision to make. How on earth do you give your kids everything you want to give them to try and alleviate that stress for them, but then not raise brats?
Yeah, I think that's really difficult. I mean, I'm outsourcing most of my decisions to ChatGPT at the moment, so that's probably what I do. But no, in seriousness though, I mean, I think that's a really difficult question to answer, and I think I sort of hope the thought would be that I wouldn't really want them getting hold of that money until they were quite a bit older. I'd love to be able to help them like once they've sort of sown all their wild oats. But I would always say, even to like people who are going to sort of try and max out a junior ISA, or, you know, like give their kids a junior ISA that sort of matures when they're 18. What I do with my kids at the moment, and we're not saving nearly enough to max it out because we can't afford to, but we're hoping to have something to give them. But what I'm doing, and some people don't like this because they're like, oh, what if they tell their friends? And I don't care. But it's get them invested in the journey, if you'll pardon the pun. So like literally, my older two are 6 and 10, and they are starting to like understand money. So they've got a current account, like they've got like a kids account with a debit card, and they like use that for their day-to-day spending. If it goes up above a certain amount with their pocket money, I give them the choice of whether to put it into their ISA or not to save for later. And sometimes they do, sometimes they don't, but they're watching that money grow. They have an investment in it. They've been paying into it. And I'm really, really hoping that means that when it matures, when they're 18, it's not going to mean that it's just like loads of money come from nowhere. Like it means something to them. But yeah, I mean, if I was going to be able to like dollop millions on them, I actually don't know what I do. I don't know if there's any control that you have as a parent actually in that situation. I don't know.
I don't know. I find it so hard because I also really want, and this is a different topic, but I really want my son to be able to do a job that he likes. And the thing that I think that's amazing about some scenarios I've seen in my life where people have had that security, where they've been helped out hugely with housing, for example, is that it's meant that there's not the pressure to go and get a job just to try and earn as much money as possible. Like if I can be in a position where my son can actually genuinely pursue something he wants to because he's not making decisions based on money alone, I would love that. But I still haven't figured out how I do that in a way that doesn't just, you know, make him be a little bratty child.
Oh, I know. It's really difficult. If anyone knows the answer, please email us.
Yeah, absolutely. But I mean, just to wrap up, because we could talk about this for days, what would you take away from Gossip Girl? If there is anything to take away about money, wealth, jobs, what would it be?
I think it is just that thing of like that it's all completely relative.
Totally.
And, you know, obviously, if we're kind of looking at anything over and above a living wage, like always you're going to be looking to the next thing and to the next thing and to the next thing. And I don't know if you ever like can be fully content living that way. And I think you're always going to see yourself as being at a disadvantage if you're always looking at the next rung, or if you're constantly surrounding yourself with people who have got like a lot more money than you.
Yeah.
And that includes online.
Totally. Yeah. And I think that is, I mean, you've summed it up. I think trying to beware of the curse of comparison, because there will always, literally always be someone richer than you, unless you're probably Elon Musk.
I know. Well, I think that is like a legit point though, of like, if you're constantly searching for the next thing and the next thing, like, look what happens when you are the richest person. Like, is he
Delulu.
happy? Don't know. Don't think so.
Yeah, I mean, I won't even go into it, but like, have you seen the article written by his daughter?
Not, I haven't read it yet, but
It's worth a read.
I've got it bookmarked.
Yeah, it's not a great write up of him as a dad.
Can imagine. I can imagine. He doesn't give off like great dad vibes, does he?
No, exactly. But anyway, I have loved having this conversation. I will probably go home and watch Gossip Girl again for the 500th time. But that is pretty much all we've got time for today. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you've enjoyed this as much as we have. If you have any feedback, comments, then please do let us know at Help Me I'm Podcast, or drop us an email at helpmeimpourpodcast@gmail.com, or just slide into our DMs.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.